Paul was a dedicated butcher with years of experience. He took pride in his craft, valuing quality and customer service. However, his financial struggles and the pressure of maintaining a comfortable lifestyle for his fiancée led him into a risky side hustle with his colleague Glen. The refrigerated van had arrived at the warehouse with the delivery of lamb carcasses, and they had been brought into the freezer room and hung. Glen removed one of the carcasses and got it ready for cutting in this enormous refrigerated warehouse in the country. In another section of the freezer was a big white chest that contained ounces of marijuana. Then Glen took the side-off lamb, placed the marijuana in the bubble-wrap freezer bag, and placed it inside the ribs. It had been a good gig. It seemed to be the perfect way to transport marijuana over the borders. The sides of lamb would now be wrapped and loaded into a different delivery van for delivery to the butchers for distribution. Paul, the delivery driver, came in. He owned one of the biggest suppliers. At Paul's shop, some of the clients would come in for a little something extra. Thursdays were always the busiest days, as it was payday for many of his customers. He had built a rod for his own back in many ways, as he would leave his house at dawn to pick up from the warehouse and then go on to work all day in the butcher's. He did this because he didn't trust anyone else to pick up the meat. He knew the fewer people that knew of the operation, the better. It had been a very lucrative business, and sales were booming. They had infiltrated a majority of large players in their area, and things were going quite smoothly. But Paul was disgruntled with the long hours and having to be the front man for the operation. It seemed that Glen had things pretty easy. Apart from guaranteeing a secure and pleasant future for his potential wife, Paul also desired fairness and consideration for his side venture. Glen informed Paul that they would have to raise the product's price due to inflation. Paul knew that the cost of meat had increased, but Glen also mentioned the cost of the drug. Paul didn't understand that part. Why would you tip the boat when it was sailing so smoothly? Glen insisted that the costs must increase. Paul believed that this was going to harm their sales and that their customers would be extremely upset once he informed them. Paul was right. As soon as he broke the news to his top buyer, he was furious. It would hit his pocket too hard. He could understand the price of meat going up, but not the product price. He would buy from somewhere else if that was the case, so Paul said he would take the message back to Glen for further review. The disgruntled buyer wanted to meet with Glen in person, but they had managed to keep the warehouse location secret for all this time, and that wasn't about to change, so Paul said he would let him know. Paul was hardworking and deeply loyal to his fiancée. He was known for his nonsensical attitude at work, but was increasingly frustrated with Glen wanting higher profits from their illegal activities. Glen refused to change his mind. He told Paul that he knew they would still buy marijuana from him since he had the best product available, and that he wasn't going to be bullied by some thugs. Where else did they think they would obtain such massive quantities of the drug? So Paul returned to renegotiate, but the negotiations didn't go as planned. The buyer had stormed out, telling him Glen was an idiot. Paul kept selling to the other customers, but without his biggest buyer, he knew there would be a shortfall. Glen had told him to wait a while because he was sure the sales would pick up, but they didn't. With the rising cost of inflation, Paul was now struggling to meet the repayments on his house and car, and he had an upcoming wedding to pay for, too. He tried time and again to get Glen to change his mind, but Glen was steadfast in his decision. Paul's fiancée Sandy was very excited about her hen's night. Among the guests was Elise, her friend of many years. Once the ladies had exhausted all the regular games they could think of, their attention turned to Elise for a future reading for Sandy. So Elise took out her antique cards and had Sandy shuffle them and take out a card to read, and the card she chose was the Emperor. She told Sandy that when the Emperor was revealed in a reading, he frequently challenged you to face strong power dynamics as they emerge in your life, including your connection with authority, your experiences of helplessness, and your utilization or misuse of various forms of power. Establish leadership and establish a framework. Take charge and create structure. Sandy felt the card probably related to her father, who didn't approve of her getting married. Then Elise explained that it was quite a positive card, so it could all turn out well. It may be related to Paul. Paul was getting deeper and deeper into debt. Every time he went to see Glen, Glen seemed to be living the dream. Paul was certain Glen had another main butcher front, and that was where the money came from. He decided to do a stakeout and watch the trucks that entered the warehouse. Paul watched the warehouse to see if any other trucks were pulling up. He followed several, but found they were just legitimate butchers. After a few weeks, he saw a different van pull up. He hadn't seen this one pull up before, so he tailed it to see where it would lead. It went to a country butcher, so Paul waited, biding his time. Seeing when the butcher had his busiest times, he would choose these times to go in and make a purchase, saying he was new to the area. After a few months, the butcher got to know him. Paul haphazardly mentioned how much he liked to smoke dope and asked if he knew anyone in the area who was selling. The butcher explained he could supply Paul with some excellent stuff, so Paul made a purchase. Paul was right. The dope came inside a side of lamb packed exactly how Glen would pack it. His suspicions had been confirmed. Glen was starting to cut him out and had bought someone new into the market. He felt angry that they had thought of this concept together from the beginning. Glen was cutting him out of the profits, but that was never going to happen. Paul felt distraught. How could Glen do this to him? They had been friends for so many years, but now he knew Glen had probably never been his true friend. He had just used him for his business ideas. He knew that if he didn't act soon, he would slide deeper into debt. With this in mind, he went to the warehouse to confront Glen. He asked Glen if there was another butcher. Glen looked like a mouse that had been caught in a trap. He tried to backpedal and told Paul that he was just setting this new distributor up and that he was going to tell Paul so he could have a cut. But Paul could see through his lies. They started to argue, and the argument escalated. Paul asked Glen if he could check on the latest shipment in the freezer box, so they both entered the freezer. Then Paul used the excuse that he had left his phone on the table outside and was waiting for a call from Sandy about the wedding plans. He exited the freezer, shut the door behind him, placed the padlock on, walked out, and went home. That night at home he had dinner with Sandy. She asked how the business was going. Paul explained that there had been a sudden change in management, and that from now on their money troubles were over. He would be able to work fewer hours as he had taken a position as manager of the warehouse and was going to get Reg to run the butcher shop. Remember to like, subscribe, and share to others, so you don't miss an episode.